All right. So we're going to jump right into chapter 9. And the first thing we're going to kind of skim through some of this. I have a couple of PowerPoints that we've taught on some of the stuff here on the channel before, so I want to show those, and that'll cover a lot of what he covered. This book was very formative in my own theology and a lot of the early Disciple Dojo teaching material, particularly our Bible for the Rest of Us course. This was one of the this book was very influential as we were developing that course 20 years ago. But right here at the front, and let me hold on, let me get my camera so it likes to fall out of focus. This is the part I want to draw your attention to on page 279. I love this line. I think this is so important. He says, if you had asked a devout Israelite in the Old Testament period, let's say one of the psalmists, are you redeemed? The answer would have been a most definite yes. And if you had asked them, how do you know? You would be taken aside to sit down somewhere while your friend recounted a long and exciting story, the story of the Exodus. For it is indeed the Exodus that provided the primary model of God's idea of redemption, not just in the Old Testament, but even in the New, where it's used as one of the keys to understanding the meaning of the cross of Christ. I love this line. Biblical redemption is Exodus shaped. And that's a huge point. That was one of those light bulb moments for me theologically, because growing up as a Christian, when you hear, especially in the South, in the Bible Belt, when you hear, I'm redeemed, you think of all the Christian cliches: blood bought, spirit filled, redeemed. I said the sinner's prayer. I went up before my church, or I was on a youth camp. And we think of all those things. And it's not that that's necessarily wrong, but that's not what redemption meant in the Bible itself. Redemption was always a metaphor in the New Testament drawn from God actually redeeming Israel, bringing Israel out of slavery. And so for Israel, the whole model of salvation was the Exodus. The Exodus is the most important event in the entire Old Testament. And for Christians, what the cross and resurrection are, for pre-Christian believers, the Exodus was. And it can't be overstated enough. It also helps us I think, and this is where, we have people here with different theologies. We have Calvinists, we have Arminianists or Arminians, communalists, Molinists, I don't know, all these different theological like ways that they work it out. But for me, the Exodus, if we keep that as the paradigm, then everything else sort of falls into place. Like, for instance, God elected, that's what the previous sessions we talked about, God's election of Israel. It was the people as a whole were the elect. And so if you were part of the people, you were part of the elect. You were going to be released from slavery. You were going to be brought into the wilderness. You were going to be transformed through the covenant. You were going to be taken into the promised land. You were going to be protected through the covenant promises. If you're part of the elect, these were the things that were promised. But each individual Israelite and each generation of Israelites had to choose this day who you will serve. They had to take the covenant upon themselves. So you couldn't coast on the laurels of your parents or your grandparents. And God had to remind Israel of that through Ezekiel. Rather, you were part of the corporate people of God. Therefore, you were part of the elect. You had been redeemed. And so because you were redeemed, then you were given the covenant, and the covenant was the response to grace, not the precursor to grace. Nobody had to fight their way out of Egypt and keep all the laws in order to be redeemed. They were redeemed first. And then as evidence of that redemption and their ongoing covenant faith, they had to live as those redeemed people. And so that's what this section, this chapter rather, chapter 9 is all about the Exodus is God's model of what it means to be redeemed. So there's discussion. He has a good discussion here about the goel, like what is a goel? And this is the word redeemer. He talks about, we're used to that concept of kinsman redeemer, like in the Ruth story, and we look at, Boaz is the redeemer. And I think he does a good job of saying your goel was like, there was one place where he called it, I can't remember if he used the phrase or I've heard it somewhere else, but somebody, it might have been him. They've used the family champion. The Goel was the family or the clan champion, the one who was responsible for making sure that the wrongs got righted. That was the job of the Goel, the redeemer. And so he gives three things that the Goel had to do on page 280, 281. The Goel was responsible for avenging bloodshed done against the family. This is before the legal system, and there was no prisons in ancient Israel, and there was decision of guilt, and the Goel was responsible for bringing to justice someone who had shed blood. The Goel was responsible for redeeming the land or slaves when an Israelite would, because of poverty, had to sell their land, or they had to sell themselves into slavery to pay off their debts, indentured servitude. It was the Goel's responsibility to make sure that the family, or the groups of family, the clan, stayed relatively intact. And so the Goel was the one who was supposed to gather the necessary means of redeeming, buying back the land, or paying off the debt and keeping the integrity of the family. And then the Goel was, this is where I put a note in here. He says the Goel, one of their responsibilities was also to provide an heir. This is one of the few times, very few times, where I think I might disagree with Chris on this. I think he might be reading this. Sorry, let me go back. I think he's getting this primarily from Ruth, but the Leverett, the Leverett marriage that he's referring to, if you read through Ruth, that's a combination of two things. Like the Leverett marriage and the Goel were not the same thing. The Levier, that's where Leverett marriage comes from, the brother-in-law, was not necessarily the Goel. And so in Ruth, what you have is a combining of two things by Ruth. Ruth is the one that suggests it. And Boaz agrees. We've talked about this on our Ruth series here on the channel. So if you're interested in kind of more of the argument behind this, it's just one of those things where I feel like, and I just put a note here, I said, is this true or is this an innovation by Ruth? I think in Ruth, I think this is an innovation. So of these three things, the providing an heir is the one that I'm not entirely sure I agree with Chris on. But in the story of Ruth, she does imply that as a Goel, you're supposed to protect the family, and the right of levirate marriage is what protected the family from dying out when there was no heir. So Ruth combines them, and whether that was the intention of the law or whether that was an innovation that is rewarded by God because it's keeping the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law, there's some debate there. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out because regardless, it does a good job of showing what it means to be a Goel, a redeemer. And so when you use that language, when Israel would use that language, they would be thinking of a family champion, somebody who keeps and protects and upholds the integrity of the family or the community. And then they apply that language to God, or rather, God speaks of himself that way, or they speak of God as their redeemer. It takes on a whole uh, new, vivid meaning, I think, when we understand what the metaphor is.
JM, there's a question in the chat. Kathleen asked, how
Mhm.
did families choose their goel? So,
That's a good question. And it's not like there was only one Goel. The Redeemer was typically the closest family member who had the responsibility. So there's not a biblical, to my knowledge, there's nothing in the Bible about determining which one it is, but it's usually whoever has the means and whoever's the closest. So, like in the story of Ruth, that does come into play when Boaz says, "I am Goel. I can redeem the field." Remember, Boaz is thinking, "I'm going to buy the land." That's what he means by being a Goel. He says, "But there's one closer than me." So what that meant was Naomi had a relative who was closer relation to her than Boaz. So that relative had the right to be the Goel, or he could pass it on it, and then Boaz would take it. So it was a little bit more fluid from my understanding of it. Um, Yeah. So anyway,
Nathan
go ahead.
Nathan has responded here. There would be a combination between the closest relation to the party in question and ranking family member or head, depending on the situation at hand. Kind of similar to
Yeah.
what you
Yeah.
are saying.
It wasn't like, oh, there's only one person. It was who can do it, who has the means to
Mhm.
do it.
Yeah.
And I think families today have this. Sometimes you'll have like siblings, and one in whatever the situation is, one will kind of be put forth as sort of, okay, you like similar to the concept of power of attorney, like whoever is the one who has the right, it's not the exact same thing, but I think it's along those lines. Like power of attorney is the person who speaks for the family or for the person. So the goel is the one who has the responsibility for protecting the family. But there can be other goelim that could arise and take their place. Okay, any other, let me see. I mean, there's so, like, we will not be able to cover everything in the reading. So I want you to feel free to ask whatever questions you have because I'm going to skim through this. Um, are there any in the chat while I'm looking for pages?
Nothing else at the moment.
Okay.
Burchard says possibly Aaron, Onan, Judah's sons, referencing Tamar.
That's the Leverett marriage. Yeah,
Oh, and that's what, okay,
yeah,
Nathan just jumped in and said that too. Yeah.
yeah,
So no other really, no other questions
yeah.
officially, at least, that we have.
Um, Here's a point that is worth mentioning. We talk about this a lot in our Exodus study here on the channel. Exodus, God is King, which is like, I don't know, 10, 15 years old now. But we're going through, this is a key component in the Exodus account. Israel, the word serve, avad, is the verb to serve. It's also the word avodah is the noun form. It means service or slavery. And so every time in Exodus, when it says the people were like slaves to Pharaoh, they were serving Pharaoh. But it's also the word for worship. So to serve Pharaoh or worship Yahweh is the same word. It's just contextually English translations make a distinction. But Israel really to serve is to worship. And that's a key part of the Exodus paradigm is God is taking Israel out from under a false god. And that's what Pharaoh was seen as part of the Egyptian pantheon. He was the firstborn of Ra, the sun god. And so he was literally worshiped, deified. God was taking Israel, he redeemed them from slavery, service, worship of Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt to slavery, worship, service of him and him alone, because no one else was worthy of worship, only God. So there, it's a wordplay, but it's throughout Exodus. It's everywhere. It's one of the major themes in the Exodus is Israel didn't just get freed because he has a discussion about this in the section where he starts talking about the two errors that people get into when it comes to the Exodus. He talks about, I think it starts on around page 300, 303. He says there's kind of twin errors that people fall into, which is either piety, personal piety, or social liberation gospel. And so people look at the Exodus, and that's what most of this chapter is about, is untangling those two twin errors that people fall into. The one error says, okay, so Israel was released from slavery in the Old Testament, but Jesus comes and releases people from slavery to sin. So it doesn't matter your spiritual, I mean, it doesn't matter your physical or your economic condition or whatever, even your literal status as slaves. This was very popular, especially in colonial slavery in this country. They would say, oh no, but you're freed spiritually. So don't worry about getting your freedom. Keep working the cotton fields, keep working the sugar plantations. You're freed spiritually because that's all that matters. Personal piety. And so the gospel, you're not supposed to worry about people's economic status or their social well-being because that's all, fill in the blank, woke, social, Marxism, all that stuff, the personal piety view. But the opposite error that he touches on is liberation gospel. And he talks about liberation theology and how it developed in some regions that said the only thing that matters, that God cares about, is freeing people from oppression economically, physically, socially. And so the gospel, actual personal repentance and living a life of holiness and righteousness, doesn't matter. What matters is we've got to be on the side of the workers. We've got to be on the side of the exploited. We have to stand against capitalism and against, the oppressors and all of that. And so he's saying those are two twin errors that we want to split the difference. We want to say, okay, liberation theology is not wrong. God did physically rescue Israel from literal slavery to economic, literal oppressor named Pharaoh in Egypt. So that should be part of the gospel, proclaiming release of the captives. But at the same time, it's not just that, because that did point forward to an even greater exodus where Jesus himself frees his people, the new exodus. This is my blood of the new covenant poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins, not for the release from Pharaoh, or in Jesus's day from Rome. So both of the views have elements of truth to it. And if we lose either of them, we go astray of the full biblical teaching on redemption. A full gospel that doesn't address people's physical needs is not the full gospel. James said this is in his letter pretty clearly. If you just, go in peace, I wish you well, and you don't give them something to eat and they're hungry, your faith is worthless. Faith without works is dead. So the liberation theology has a point. And personal piety and people that like to preach all about that, and they're big on your personal repentance, say the sinner's prayer, do your devotionals, tithe, be in church every Sunday and on Wednesday nights for the family night supper and all the other stuff. But who cares what's happening in the world, and people actually being fed and clothed and educated and cared for their health? That's just as dead. So those were the two things he pointed out. And again, I don't remember. It's around page 300. Yeah. Yeah. He calls them the error one. If you want to mark it, if you didn't catch it in your reading. Yeah. Page 293, the spiritualizing interpretation. That's the first error. And then on page 300, the politicizing interpretation is the second error, liberation theology. And then he says with both of these is a great point about, this goes for both of them, but he says the problem is not what it says, but where it stops. When he's talking about liberation theology, it's just, it limits to just social gospel instead. And he's the point he's making is, if you are just doing what's called the social gospel of just alleviating people's needs, you're no different than the Peace Corps or any other secular humanitarian organization. The thing that makes mission different is it is grounded and rooted in the lordship of Christ and the triune God. And it does stand against idolatry, including the idolatry of political dependence and all of the stuff that so much of the isms of this world are based on. So anyway, that was a really good point, and I wanted to make sure we're going to discuss a little bit more of this in the breakout session. But any questions from chapter 9? Because we're going to move on pretty soon.
I think we're good, JM, unless somebody wants to jump in, but I don't have any hands raised that I see or anything in the chat.
Okay. Let me point out this paragraph is really good on page 308. When he's talking about Israel, just kind of, this is what he said, what Israel gets criticized for. And he said, according to the strong and imperative logic of Deuteronomy 26, of people who knew what they had been redeemed from and by whom they had been redeemed could not come before their God with thank offerings and expect God's continued blessing without ensuring, first of all, that they had obeyed the law very specifically by providing for the needy in their midst, the familyless, the homeless, and the landless. No acceptable worship without the poor. In stark contrast, the prophet saw people whose appetite for worship was insatiable. This is what Amos cries out about, but whose daily lives were a denial of all the moral standards of the God they claimed to worship. And this line will hit like a sledgehammer for a lot of us. It says there was plenty of charismatic fervor, and he quotes Amos as an example, plenty of atonement theology in the blood of multiple sacrifices, Isaiah chapter 1, plenty of assurance of salvation in the recitation of soundbite claims about the temple, Jeremiah 7, plenty of religious observance at great festivals and conventions, Isaiah 1, but beneath their noses and under their feet, the poor were uncared for at best and trampled on at worst. Spiritual religion flourished amid social rottenness. Sacred rites went hand in hand with social wrongs, and God hated it. God longed for somebody to shut down the whole charade, Malachi 1. And finally, God wiped it out of his sight. This, like right now in our culture, we are seeing some people that are glorying in displays of civil religion. They are like, finally, we've got prayer meetings at the Pentagon. This is bringing God back into the government. This, and Old Testament and New Testament, God does not care about any of that if the people who are the most needy are not being cared for at the same time. So whenever I see people, and I'm not making this political because both sides can do it. Both sides can kind of play up their particular brand of Jesus. Um, Anytime I see that, though, I just think God's not impressed with any of that. God does not need a march on Washington or a national day of prayer or in God we trust printed on our money. It's not like any of that is necessarily wrong, but Israel had all that more than us. And they were actually in covenant with God, unlike America. We've never been in covenant with God. Israel literally was in covenant with God, and none of it counted for anything. The prophets said, I hate this. I despise your festivals. Get away from me with the noise of your worship and your sacrifices. I will not accept. I mean, just really intense repudiation of civil displays of religion because the deeper things of the law were not being followed with that much fervor. And that's something that to me, that's a, like I said, that's a gut punch to a lot of cultural Christianity. And I'm not going to bash the church and be like, so every church that's doing civil displays, whatever, I'm not going that far, but I'm just saying that public piety is no cover for neglecting the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the sojourner, all those categories that universally God is saying take care of. Now, what that looks like and how we take care of them, that's where Christians are going to have differences. That's where you're going to get the political divides. And you're going to say, I think the free market is better at taking care of them. Well, I think a social health safety net is better at taking care of them. Well, I think taxes should do it. I think personal donation. There will be all that disagreement, but the underlying ethic that that should be driving us is how do we care for the people that need someone to care for them. So anyway, that couldn't end this chapter without mentioning that. All right, we ready to move on to chapter 10, or did anybody have something, either a question or a comment from chapter 9 that they want to
We don't
drop?
have any hands. We don't have any questions. We have a comment
Yeah.
in the chat from Nathan. He said, I didn't really think the Amos 5:21 to 24 reference was representative of charismatic fervor, but the point is still okay.
He's not theologically charismatic, but of just interest or I don't know. Let me hold on.
Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing is in our political environment, a lot of what you reference in those displays happen to be within the charismatic lane, but the public displays themselves could be done by anyone.
Yeah,
If the goal was, God is on a stage now.
yeah. I mean, when I think when Wright's using, because again he's British, I don't think he means charismatic as in like Pentecostal. I think he's using charismatic as in like exuberant,
Yeah.
which you can have people who are not even remote. I mean, Dominionists, they're the furthest thing from Pentecostal you can get, and they're real exuberant about public displays. So I think that's what he's aiming at, but I want to double check so the Amos passage, just if anybody didn't have it. I despise your religious feasts. I cannot stand your assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring me choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream. Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the desert, O house of Israel? So they're doing that is what he's referring to as their religious fervor. That's what he means by charismatic. They it's not like they weren't doing the worship. They were doing all the sacrifices. They were doing all the festivals, all the music, all that. And God was just like, yeah, I hate all that because you're not doing justice, which is the most important thing.
Nathan said good point. And I think that's all we have for now. We want to go on to the next
Okay.
chapter.
Well, let's jump into chapter 10. Again, we're moving fast tonight because we had 4 chapters. So chapter 10 was all about the Jubilee, and so if the Exodus is God's model for redemption, bringing you out of slavery, then the Jubilee is God's model for what it's going to look like when he restores. When after you've broken the covenant, or after you've gone astray, or after things seem like they're done, when God restores and puts back together. And so this whole chapter was about the Jubilee. And the Jubilee, it's one of those things that so it can become a Christian word. Now, this is in charismatic circles like Pentecostal care. They love Jubilee. You'll hear the phrase Jubilee all the time. You'll even see ministries called Jubilee ministries. I knew one here in Charlotte. But a lot of times people don't understand sort of the nuts and bolts of what the Jubilee year was supposed to accomplish. And so he walks through that. And he was basically saying Jubilee can be summed up theologically. Well, it had different angles. So in its context, and Jubilee comes from the word Yovel. Yovel is the ram's horn. So the blowing of that horn that's where Jubilee comes from. It had some specific purposes, or he calls them angles. So there's the social angle. It was Israel's kinship system. That in Israel was a 3-tiered kinship. So you had the tribe, and then the clan, and then the household. Those were the structures. So you had Israel as a nation. Within Israel, 12 tribes. Within each tribe, you had the different clans. And then within each clan, you had a bunch of different families. So everybody fit into that. And the Jubilee was basically keeping everything that God had distributed among the tribes and the clans and the families within them, so that they did not get wiped out economically over the generations. So that was one part of it, keeping the family intact. There was an economic angle, how how the land tenure worked. And he said there were 2 things that made Israel completely different than the Canaanite economic structure. There was equitable distribution, and then there was inalienability. It's a hard word to say. So what he was saying was when God distributed the land, you see this in Joshua. Joshua's a land grant treaty, a lot of the book. it was distributed. Not everybody got everything exactly equal, but it was distributed proportionally to the tribes. And it wasn't just whichever tribe is the strongest gets the most land, or whichever one has the best army, or anything like that. Like in Numbers 26 and Joshua 13 through 21, the land was distributed, the tribes were dispersed, and then it was inalienable. It was not to be bought and sold as a commercial asset, but to remain as far as possible within the extended family, or at least within the circle of families in the clan. And so that's why, like what Ahab does in 1 Kings 21 is so abhorrent. That's why God gives regulations about it in Leviticus 25. So it's a key part. God did not, what he's pointing out is there's nothing wrong with generational wealth, but there is, at least in Israel's covenant national existence, what God didn't want to see happen was generational wealth that expands and absorbs others. So you could be blessed and be fruitful and grow, and you could bring forth abundance in what with what you'd been given and increase your wealth. There's nothing wrong with that. But when your wealth was dependent on, oh, well, my next door neighbor, they had a really rough season and had to sell themselves into slavery and had to sell their, so I'm going to buy their land and then I'm going to buy them. And then when I die, I'm going to pass that on to my kids. That land now is forever taken from one unit and given to another. And that's what the Jubilee was meant to, once a generation, give or take, every 50 years, was meant to say, reset. We'll take it back to, in terms of ownership, where we were. If you're in debt, if you're a slave, and remember, slaves were debt slaves. They had to sell themselves to slavery. They weren't chattel slavery. It wasn't because of skin color. Um, there was release. Every 50 years, it was like starting over again. And so he talks about that the third angle, the theological angle, is because it was God's land and God's people. That's what the 25, Leviticus 25:23 gives the rationale. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. This is to Israel. They are called foreigners and strangers in the land. So whenever you hear people talking about Israel and the land and God gave it to them forever and it's their land, and all the implications in modern political geopolitics, Leviticus 25:23 is a stark reminder that no, they're foreigners and sojourners in God's land. He's the one who ultimately owns it. So the land was owned by Yahweh, given to Israel. That's the essence of the land theology. And that pushes against some popular surface level understandings of what was going on. But the Jubilee, that was the purpose of it. We're gonna, in the discussion time, we're gonna have a chance to discuss the quote. There's a quote on page 318 that we're gonna discuss, so we'll save that for our end. But on page three, so this on page 320 and 321, he gives the theological points of Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25 is the Jubilee chapter, and he brings out this is the purpose of this thing. What the Jubilee required of Israel theologically in terms of their relationship. It's not just, again, it's not just legal. This is the law, and they kept it because they had to, because it's one of the 613 commandments, and that's just what you do. There are principles in these laws. The law shows us the type of lawgiver. The laws were always a reflection of the lawgiver. And so kings in the ancient Near East that gave laws, they wanted to be seen as good and just and wise and noble lawgivers. And so they would brag about how good their laws were. The laws reflect the lawgiver. So the principles that he points out, to keep the Jubilee, required trust in the sovereignty of the Lord, of God, over time and nature. That every seventh seven was to be the Jubilee. That was to trust that, okay, God, you're in charge of this. I think I should manipulate time this way in order to get this much interest or this good investment, but you have said no, it's going to be like this. So that is an element of trust. You had to have faith in God's provision, his providence, the one who could command blessings in the natural order and thereby provide for your basic needs. Like you had to trust that God would give you enough to make up for whatever you might have lost from an economic standpoint. It was an element of trust. The Jubilee, it was a reminder rather, working out the implications within community for the fact that all Israelites were simply the former slaves of Pharaoh, now the redeemed slaves of Yahweh. So the way you treated the slaves and releasing slaves during Jubilee, that'd be economic suicide. Like you just spent all this money to buy these indentured servants, and next year's a Jubilee year, you're going to lose all that work. It's much easier to just keep them enslaved and forget this whole Jubilee thing. But God was calling Israel, no, you're going to be different. The economics of the kingdom don't always make sense. The law of gleaning doesn't make sense. You should harvest every scrap of what you have slaved and labored to grow, because every bite you don't gather is a bite you take out of your family's mouth. And God says, no, you have to trust me. Trust me that I'm going to provide. Just like I did when you were gathering manna in the wilderness and I told you, don't do it on the seventh day. I'll give you enough to hold you over. So all of these, they were a reminder of their slave status. It was tied to Yom Kippur, the experience of forgiveness, release of slaves, and release from guilt of the prisoner or the captive. These were concepts that the Jubilee instilled. And then also it pointed forward to an eschatological hope that there would be a final Jubilee, that there would be one day there would be a Jubilee of not just releasing and restarting things over in this little plot of land in the Middle East, but there would be a worldwide reset, a renewed creation that takes things not just back to the way they were in Eden, but that's a renewed Eden. It's a garden, but it's also a city. It's God's people and him dwelling among them and all the nations of the earth, every tribe, language, people, nation, all of it. So this was a really good, and this explains then on page 325, he talks about there's a reason that, no, 323, sorry. There's a reason that Jesus began his ministry in Nazareth, his public ministry, with the Nazareth Manifesto, Luke chapter 4, directly quoting Isaiah's use of the Jubilee. The Isaiah 61 is entirely built on the Jubilee concepts. And that's what Jesus decided when he said, today this has been fulfilled in your hearing. He directly quoted Isaiah's use. So the Jubilee had its own history in Torah. And then by the time of the prophets, the Jubilee had become a symbol or a pointer forward to the release from captivity for Israel, who had gone into captivity because of their own sin, their own breaking the covenant. God said, I'm going to release you. There's going to be a national Jubilee. And so Jesus stands up in Nazareth and when he cites that prophecy and says, this is what today is in your hearing, this is being fulfilled. So that's, again, all of that is really easy to gloss over because who's reading Leviticus 26? Like who's doing a in-depth study of the Jubilee in order to better understand the gospel? That's part of why I love this book so much, is it ties it together, all these threads. Okay, we're actually doing pretty good on time. Any questions on chapter 10 or anything stood out from chapter 10?
We do have, pardon me, one question in the chat.
Okay.
On page 310, says Wright states that God is a realist. One short statement that packs so much theology. Can you expand upon that statement?
Yeah. He goes on to say, it was one thing to rescue people from foreign exploitation and give them a land of their own. That means bringing Israel out of Egypt. It would be another thing to keep them from exploiting one another. So what he's saying is God knew Israel is going to, like Israel being released from Egypt is going, that's not going to keep Israel from not acting Egyptian towards people in their midst. The released oppressed can easily become the oppressor, very easily. And actually, the history of the world shows that every revolution in history that starts off so noble ends up being bloody and violent. And the people who gain power, once they're in power, what do? They turn around and do the exact same thing that was done to them to the people that they now have power over. And God knew that that's a sin thing, that's a human heart thing. And so he gave Israel the Jubilee as a tangible way of saying, here's a reminder, you're not to become another Egypt. You're not to become another oppressor. You know what it's been like to be oppressed. So that's what he means. God's a realist. He knows the depths of sinfulness in the human heart. And he was giving Israel, that's what Torah is. Torah, remember, we talked about Torah means it's from the verb yara, which means to point. So it's to point Israel in the direction that they should go rather than having them go the way of the other nations. And so yeah, that's what that's a really important point. That's where liberation theology sometimes fails. They think the whole goal is just liberating people. And then you're like, no, because once they come into power, they start doing the same thing. Why? Because power corrupts. And so the Jubilee is a check on God's power on power in Israel that God gave his people. And interestingly, there's debate in biblical scholarship. The Jubilee, there is no evidence that it was ever kept. We have no evidence that Israel ever one time kept the Jubilee. And if we read the prophets, I don't think we have good reason to think Israel ever did, because they were constantly railing against Israel for not doing the thing that the Torah told them to do in terms of caring for the poor and the widow. And Israel did exactly Israel became Egypt, all the way down to Solomon. What did he do when he consolidated his power? He used slave labor. He went to Egypt for his horses. He built lavish palace for himself. He did all the things that Torah had told kings not to do, took many wives, allowed them to bring in foreign gods. Israel became Egypt. Israel became Assyria, Israel became Babylon, and ultimately God treated them like all those nations and they were destroyed, sent into exile. And then the Jubilee took on this meaning of, oh, one day it's all going to be renewed. So the Jubilee, yeah, I personally don't think Israel ever kept the Jubilee. I think that's part of why the prophets were so ticked off, is because Israel didn't do what Torah told them to do. And that's how you got these families owning like these few owning everything and the many owning nothing. That wouldn't have happened if they had been keeping Jubilee. So, somebody got a hand raised?
Yep, Dean.
Yo. Bueller.
Where did he go?
You're muted.
There we go. How's that?
There,
Gotcha.
now we can hear you.
Technology. Good. Yeah, when I was reading page 312 talking about the Father's house, it talked about the third and the fourth generation. I wondered if that
Yes.
has a tie-in to some of the curses, the generational curses. Having a sin of a father, would affect more than just that one person.
Yes, I'm glad. Yes, you and you had emailed me that question. I'm glad you mentioned it. Talking about Israel's kinship system and the father's house being an extended family that could comprise 3 to 4 generations living together. I think that's absolutely what God says when he reveals his name to Moses in Exodus. And in fact, sorry, I have to keep my headphones on because my Zoom echoes if I don't. If you look in Exodus, what is it? 32, right after the golden calf. Let's go here. And when God reveals his name, I think this is absolutely key for God revealing his name. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Yeah, when Moses asked God to show him his glory, and right here. So it says, this is Exodus 34:6, and he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, and NIV says the Lord, but it's Yahweh, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in chesed and faithfulness, maintaining chesed to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. So it's like the God's just this super generous to thousands. I mean, there hasn't been thousands of, there's a question if this is thousands of people or thousands of generations, or Eleph, the word for thousand means like clan or tribe or something. That is less important than verse 8. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He, and it's literally he visits upon, but he punishes or visits the children and their children, the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. So the comparison is God's mercy is to the thousands and his judgment is to the third and fourth. So you could say that just shows that God's mercy is extravagant. Even though his judgment's real, it's just to the third and fourth generation. I don't think it's because Ezekiel will go on to say very clearly, God does not punish the children for the sins of the father. That's why I don't think NIV does a good translation here, and I've corrected it in this Bible, is it doesn't say he's punishing the third and fourth generation. It's saying he's visiting the iniquity upon them. My take on it, and not everybody agrees, but for what it's worth, because this is my channel, my take on it is that's exactly what he's referencing. The sin of the head of the household, the father's house. He's talking about one family unit. And the sin of that family household does resonate, just like Achan's sin in Joshua, where the family was punished. It's not that, oh, your dad did something bad, so now I'm going to punish you. It's within this house, you as a household collectively are not in covenant with God, or you're in rebellion against God. And the iniquity of the father gets visited upon the children to the third and fourth generation, because that's who would be living in one household. Not today where we have the nuclear family and, you don't live with your grandparents. Back then, no, you lived with parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and your own children. Those four generations were usually in one household. So that's a really good question. I'm glad you remembered to ask that, because I wanted to speak to it. I think that's exactly what God was referencing. Okay, any other questions? We got 30 more minutes before we break out, or actually slightly less, and 2 whole chapters. What we're going to do in this one is I've got another, so after Jubilee, chapter 11, the missional span of God's covenant. This is all about, like, why is covenant? What are covenant? We've been using the word covenant for a while. What is covenant? What's the purpose of it? And then the covenant at Sinai, like, what's going on? What's the purpose behind that? Those are the passages that people get bogged down when they're reading in their read through the Bible in a year plan. And so it's important to understand what covenant is. He gives overviews of the 5 biblical covenants. He talks about on page 328. He starts with the covenant with Noah, and then he talks about the covenant with Abraham. Some people say there's a covenant at Adam because a prophet later says, as at Adam, they have broken the covenant. He writes but the text never specifically, in Genesis at least, doesn't say that there was a covenant with Adam. That's a debate for covenant theologians. But specifically, the covenant is mentioned under Noah, the covenant with Abraham, which we've already looked at, why God called Abraham. That's what we talked about in the last session. Then the covenant at Sinai. Now it's where the promise to a family is now going to be carried out through a people. That's what it's going to look like, how God's going to keep his promise to Abraham. He's going to keep it through this covenant people. And he gives key passages that the covenant is about. Exodus 19, that they're going to be a kingdom of priests, and they're going to be a segula, a personal possession is how he translates that. Then And there's a lot on that. So he's unpacking. Then Leviticus 26, he will dwell among them. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. So God's going to dwell with his people. That's entirely new in, at least in their history, but also in the history of most of the people in the world. And that's where he talks about the Levitical purity, the sacrificial system, cleanliness, all of that stuff. That's what we're about to talk about in a minute, but I'm going to show you a PowerPoint that kind of helps make sense of it. And then what's the last verse? And then Deuteronomy 27 through 32, what they're going to actually do. They're not going to keep the covenant. They're going to break it. And when they do, there's going to be exile. But after exile, there's going to be restoration. So the Sinai covenant was never, it was always known that they're going to break the covenant and that God has a plan even in their disobedience. It's still not going to undo the promise he made to Abraham, even if Israel, forfeits their national identity through the exile. So that's why this section is long. That's what's going on. Then he gets to the Davidic covenant, and that all of this is going to happen, and it's going to happen headed up by a king, the anointed one, the Messiah, who is going to be the one who will rule in the spirit of David and the line of David. And so what's the purpose of the king? And what the ideal king is going to be, a king for all nations, on page 347. He's going to build a temple, and that temple on page 349 is going to be a house of prayer for all nations. So he's tying in, remember, this book is the mission of God. So he's tying in, how does any of this relate to the nations? A lot of people think, oh, the promise to Israel, the Sinai covenant and the Davidic kingship, that's just about God, Israel being God's chosen people, and God loving their king and loving them more than anybody in the world. And what Wright's doing is he's saying, no, read the text. Throughout the text, there are clear indications that the calling of even of the nation of Israel and their set apartness of Torah is for the purpose of bringing the nations knowledge of God, and even their king, who will be, I will strike them with a rod of iron, and he will, even that is for the purpose of judging the nations justly and ruling the nations justly. And that's what no earthly king could do that. But it pointed forward to there would be a Davidic king who would do that. And part of that is building a house of prayer for all nations. Now, Solomon did that with the Jerusalem temple, but it didn't do the job. It was a precursor. What would ultimately need to happen would be a kingdom not built by human hands, that would be a place where all the nations could come to the Lord. So this is one of the richest chapters in the whole book, I think. And then he cites New Testament examples of passages that build on all of this. So David's greater son, he cites Luke 1 and 2. He cites passages in Acts. He cites Romans 1 through 5, specifically mentioning Jesus as the son of David, and Romans 15. So the book of Romans is bookended with this heir of David language. Revelation, the root of David, has fulfilled the promise to Abraham. The mission of God is complete. The vision is in Revelation 5 through 7. So this is, he's basically saying this is both testaments, old and new. Then he points to the new covenant, and he does the opposite. He says the new covenant is not just a New Testament concept, it's rooted in the prophetic hope. So he goes back to Jeremiah, how Jeremiah pointed forward to it, how Ezekiel pointed forward to it, how Isaiah pointed forward to it. So he ends, he says, I must emphasize again the underlying narrative that binds all the Old Testament covenant articulations together. Necessarily, we've had to pick our way through a selection of texts in each case, but binding them all together is the grand narrative of God's mission, ever since Abraham, to bring blessing to the nations through this people whom he has called to be his special possession, his segulah. This is not just any story. This is the story, providing Israelites with their fundamental worldview and providing Christians also with ours. For this is the God we worship in Jesus. This is the people to whom we belong through faith in Jesus. This is the story of which Jesus is the climax and which he will eventually bring to its grand finale. And covenant runs through this story like a core nerve. So really, really good insight into the purpose of the covenant, the importance of it. He has, yeah. Let's let me switch over to. Let me share. Okay. All right, you guys see that?
Mm.
What do you see on your screen?
Hebrew poetic
Yeah.
imagery.
Okay, cool.
We're good, JM. Sorry.
Okay, good, because I can't see what y'all see. So in the this is all of Scripture. The image, the worldview, like when we think of heaven and hell, if I use image of fire or pearly gates or clouds, I'm talking about a cultural view of heaven and a cultural view of hell. Pitchforks, fires, that's what we associate with hell, even though Scripture has none of that. Well, it has fire, but even then it's outer darkness. So how do you have dark fire? But those are just cultural resonances, right? So in the biblical mind, and this is outside of Scripture as well, in ancient Near East, the imagery was you had life and death, you had exile and salvation. So in Israel, life was characterized by ascent toward God. And can y'all see my cursor?
Mm-hmm.
Yes? Okay. So life was characterized by ascending towards God. That means death is characterized by descending away from God. So ascent towards God is life, descent away from God is death. This explains phrases like, I will be like those going down to the pit. That's what this means. This is talking about death, going away from God. Or you have lifted me up. You have exalted me. The up language is towards God. Down language is towards death. Likewise, exile is symbolized by expulsion from God's mountain. So in the ancient world, the idea was the gods, where do gods dwell? They dwell on a mountain. Whether it's the Greek gods on Olympus, whether it's Baal on Mount Zaphon, the gods are on a mountain. And so to be excluded from the mountain of the gods or the mountain of God is a way of saying exiled, like sent away from God's presence. And so therefore, being brought up from the depths to God's mountain is an image of salvation in the ancient mind. So this is what you see all throughout the Hebrew Bible. Michael Morales has done a wonderful job of presenting this in his book, Who Shall Ascend to the Mountain of the Lord? That's where this diagram is from. And so this was kind of the worldview of the ancient world. You had Sheol down here. This is where when you die, and you had the mountain of God up here. And then over that, you had the Rakia, the firmament, and that held back the Mabul, the flood waters. Under that, you had the depths, the Tehom, the abyss. And down here in the watery depths is where the Tanin were, the sea serpent, the sea monsters. So this is sort of how the ancient world pictured creation. And the biblical authors reference this all the time in so many places. We won't even go through them all, but I just wanted to give you this to see. So exile means going down to the depths. Salvation means going up to the mountain of God. And you see this, there's numerous examples here, but see Michael Morales for that. We don't have time to get into it. Now, the tabernacle. We have a video series, by the way, that touches on all of these things in our playlist on the YouTube channel. I think it's a Sinai playlist or I can't remember what it's called. It's like Understanding Sinai or something like that. It's a playlist on YouTube. I have 30 minute to hour long videos on all of these topics. So if you're just like, wait, I didn't get it, see that playlist. But the tabernacle, one of the things that a lot of people don't notice, and Vern Poythress was who first turned me on to this 25 years ago when I learned it. If you closely read the tabernacle instructions, the bottom of the outer court, the pedestals that all the tabernacle poles sit on, is bronze. But the top of all of the outer curtain, the pedestal at the top, is silver. Then when you move into the tabernacle itself, the bottom of the tabernacle is all silver. And then inside the tabernacle is all gold. So what that is showing in horizontal space a three-dimensional, you're ascending. As you go into the tabernacle, bronze to silver to gold, you're symbolically ascending the mountain of God to where his presence, where God dwells on his holy mountain. The tabernacle is like taking Mount Sinai and smushing it down flat and making it portable. Because they couldn't build a tower everywhere they went, but they could put up the tabernacle, and it was symbolically the mountain of God. And it was a mountain that moved with them wherever they went. They never had to go, oh, God dwells way up there on Mount Zaphon, or God's way up there on Olympus. No, God is there in our midst. So that's the whole concept of the tabernacle. And therefore, going towards the inner courts was going towards Eden, the mountain of God. Eden is called the mountain of God, even though it wasn't actually a mountain in Ezekiel. I think it's Ezekiel or Isaiah. It's called, you were in Eden, the mountain of God, because it's God's presence. So going towards Eden was going up the mountain. Therefore, going away from the Holy of Holies was going down toward the wilderness, towards death. And so this was the whole symbolism of Israel's tabernacle system. And so exile here's the illustration of the mountain of God. This is Eden in Genesis, how it's depicted. There's cherubim there. There's the river that comes out and splits into 4 headwaters. There's the tree of life. That was mountain imagery. And so Exodus, the Holy of Holies, that's what the Holy of Holies is. It's to symbolize the mountain of God. There's the tree of the menorah and the lampstands. There's the cherubim woven into the curtain that separate the Holy of Holies from the holy place. You're going out. There's the basin that you would wash that was used for preparing the sacrifices. So all this imagery, this is what it communicates or to the ancient world. So the tabernacle, mountain of God, portable and horizontal instead of vertical. So that's the main thing to keep in mind. And this is also, you see this is what Mount Sinai was in Exodus 19 and 24, the mountain of God. All the Israelites had to stay at the bottom. They weren't allowed to come up on the mountain. Aaron, the priest, and the elders, they got to come up on the mountain and eat a meal in the presence of God. They saw God and they ate. But only Moses and Joshua got to come into the direct presence of God at the top of Mount Sinai. So that's what the tabernacle symbolized. And anyway, like I said, we got a whole video on all this. So what Christopher Wright says, and this is in his Exodus commentary, not in Mission of God, but he's written a commentary on Exodus and the Story of God commentary series. He says, the approach toward the presence of God is graded. There are 3 levels arranged vertically from the foot to the top of the mountain. This gradated approach to God in the vertical axis becomes the model for the gradation within the tabernacle and later the temple on the horizontal axis. The tabernacle becomes a kind of portable Mount Sinai. Now, he wrote this long after I'd been teaching this, by the way. I'm just saying. I don't know if he got it from me or not, but I have to tell him that next time he comes on the channel. No, but I've been saying this for a long time. Our video on it is called God's Mobile Home, because the tabernacle is a portable Mount Sinai. And the temple court uniting heaven and earth, joining God with his people through their representatives, mediator, and the blood of sacrifice. So that's the symbolism of Exodus. So Israel had a portable Mount Sinai, and you see the gradations are in how Israel's set up as a camp in the book of Numbers. You have the tabernacle in the middle. Surrounding the tabernacle, you have the Levites. These are the clans of the Levites. And with each of these clans, you would have the different fathers' houses. And then surrounding the Levites, you had all Israel. And then what's outside of the camp? The nations, the wilderness, the unclean. So that's the biblical concept of holiness, is God's presence. The Levites protected the Israelite or mediated God's holiness to the tribes of Israel. Israel was to be the mediator of God's holiness to the Gentile nations. That's why God says, I will make you a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. So holiness in Israel, that's the three. You had the Levites, and then even within Israel, you had the Levites, and then you had the priests, and then you had the high priest who could enter into the presence of God. So all these threefold gradations you start to see in Israel's entire sacrificial system, and it corresponds to humanity as a whole. You have Yahweh, his divine presence. You had the Levites. They were holy. They could enter into the presence of God if they fulfilled certain requirements that God had set. And then you had the Israelites. They were common. They were clean, but they were common. And then you had the Gentiles. They were unclean. Outside. So these are the gradations of holiness: unclean to clean and common to holy. And what can never happen in Levitical system is holy can never come in contact with unclean. And we have, like I said, we have a whole video on this, but this is the holiness and the purity in Israel. You've got what's holy, and then you have what's common. And then within what's common, you have things that are pure or clean, and you have things that are impure or unclean. And so lay people in Israel constantly went back and forth between the status of impure and pure, unclean and clean. You had a bodily discharge, you're unclean. What do? You just wash in water, and at the end of the evening, you're clean. You gave birth, a natural, normal, good thing. It makes you ceremonial unclean. So you're constantly navigating this. The priest had to live between holy in the tabernacle, doing the work, handling the sacrifices, and common but clean. That's why priests couldn't do things that lay Israelites could do, because it would make them unclean. So priests had to stay in this liminal space because God himself dwelled only in holiness. So anyway, this is the laws that Leviticus has in 12 through 15. Things outside the camp are considered profane. Things in the camp are to be common. And then within the common, things in the worship assembly have to be holy. And these three areas need to be kind of, transitioned from one another. Same with dietary laws. The foods in Leviticus 11, you have all the animals, they're unclean, all the animals of the world that you can't eat. Within that, then you have the clean animals, and you could eat these. Then within the clean animals, you had the sacrificial animals. These are the ones you could offer as sacrifices. You could not offer every clean animal as a sacrifice. And not every animal is a clean animal. So there's threefold gradation. That's what Israel was to be in the world. This is from Jacob Milgram. He's a Jewish scholar, he's done a lot of work on this, but it's all reflecting this, what God wants Israel to be. At the inner, you have priests at the innermost core of holiness, and then outside of the priests, you have all of Israel, and then outside of all of Israel, you have all humanity. Well, that's the same thing with the dietary laws. You have the sacrificial animals. Outside the sacrificial animals, you have the few animals that Israel could eat, and then there are all the animals, and that's who humanity could eat. Remember, God told Noah, and God told Gentiles in Genesis, you can eat all the animals. I give them to you as food after the flood. So anyway, this is important understanding, because there's a lot of stuff that pops up about views on dietary laws, and you got a lot of people that kind of selectively read the Torah and try to derive diet principles from them, or, well, this is why these animals are unclean, and this is why these animals are unclean. But none of that's really biblical. The food laws symbolize the division of humanity. And so when Jesus comes after Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit descends, the big thing they have to figure out is Gentiles are coming to faith. What does that mean? And to figure it out, God gives Peter a vision of what? Of the food laws, the animals that are clean and unclean, because the food laws always symbolized the Jew-Gentile division, or sorry, the Israel-Gentile division. Anyway,
Hey, Jan,
yeah,
before we
yeah.
go too much farther, Colton has his hand up. I just thought,
What
Colton,
you got, Colton?
Yeah, no, you went right where I was going with
Okay.
the with Luke Acts, with Peter, and
Perfect.
even that, and I stuck it in the chat, but even that gradation you see in the way that Luke uh writes about from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and then to the othermost parts of the world. You see that
Yeah.
same gradation taken further. Um, and
Yep.
it's not something I'd thought about before in this way, but as soon as you started saying it, I was like, oh yeah, this Luke's just writing right out of the playbook.
Yes.
And then that copied with Peter's, I mean, that in conjunction with that story about Peter
Hmm.
about the clean and unclean, I think it makes it really, really clear that
Yep.
that's what's going on. Because when Israel, when Jerusalem becomes the city of God, it becomes Mount Zion, you
Hmm.
know. And even today, when you go to the Israel, you make Aliyah, you go up,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
You know, like none of that. That's all based on historical understanding. You know, none of that's by accident. So
Yeah.
even that's all part of it too. It's even
Yeah. Yeah.
it's all built into the language there too.
Yeah, yeah. If we understand the world symbolism, then it starts to shed new light on how we look at all of this stuff. And like Jerusalem, everybody, Aliyah means to go up. Well, if you're from Denver, Colorado, and you move to Jerusalem, you're not going up, you're actually going down. Or if you're from Mount Hermon and you come to Jerusalem, you're not going up geographically, you're going down in elevation, but theologically, you're going up. And that's why in Isaiah and Micah, they both get the same vision. The mountain of the Lord will be the highest of all the mountains, meaning it's not right now. Jerusalem's not even a mountain. I mean, it's barely a hill. Yeah, you have to walk across a couple of valleys, Kidron Valley or Gehenna to get there. But Jerusalem is, if you've hiked Colorado, you're fine in Jerusalem elevation wise. But theologically, you're going up. And that's part of this concentric pattern that you see throughout the Old Testament. You see it in the land as well. Like you have all the earth is the Lord's. That's the domain of mankind. Then you have Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And then within Eretz Israel, you have Jerusalem and the temple. That's where God uniquely dwells. It doesn't mean God's not dwelling in all the earth. I mean, that's Ezekiel got that message loud and clear when God packed up and left the temple and came to him in Babylon. So God's everywhere, but he specially in a unique way dwells with his people, in the midst of his people, geographically, literally in the book of Numbers, and then theologically throughout scripture. So when Solomon builds the temple, that's what he's talking about. People turning towards this temple to pray. God, will you hear their prayers? I mean, all this, see this pattern and you start to see it everywhere. And that's the beauty of it, I think.
Hmm.
Just to recap, in chapter 12, we're going to move on. We're not going to spend hardly any time in chapter 12 because I want y'all to have discussion. But chapter 12 is he's looking at passages that have to do with tying ethics to, he's looking at passages tying ethics to mission. So, what chapter 12 is showing is that Israel's mission always uh, include or entailed them living ethically. And by ethically, it doesn't just mean being a good person. He means living according to Torah and that having manifestation in their life in how they actually treated people. And so there's, I mean, you could literally do the whole Old Testament and find this concept in pretty much anywhere, but he pulls specific passages. He pulls Genesis 18, and that's the passage of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he talks about the covenant, but right before God goes to, the purpose of Sodom and Gomorrah, right before God goes to judge the cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, and the surrounding cities, he has this fascinating monologue with himself. And God says to himself, or intertrinitarianly, if you want to read it that way, however, Abraham will indeed become a great and mighty nation, and all nations on earth will find blessing through him. For I have known or chosen him for the purpose that he will teach his sons and his household after him, so they will keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice, for the purpose that, or so that, this is Chris Wright's translation, Yahweh will bring about for Abraham what he promised to him. So this is God's purpose in calling Abraham, and it's stuck right in front of one of the most vivid scenes of judgment in the Torah. So anyway, Israel's election was for the purpose of being different, Abraham's offspring, and ultimately for the purpose of blessing the nations. Even as God is judging a particular subset of the nations, God was willing to not judge them if only 10 righteous people could be found. And he has a great discussion about how it's not a bartering session. Abraham didn't have to haggle with God. God was willing to do even more. Every time Abraham came with a price, God was like, yeah, I'll pay it. So it's like going to a bazaar in the old city in Jerusalem and saying, oh, how much for this lamp? And they're like, oh, 50 shekels. And you're like, what if I give you 30? Okay, 30 shekels. What if I give you 20? Okay, 20 shekels. That would be a terrible bargainer. God wasn't trying to bargain. He wanted to show grace. And the fact of the matter was there were not enough people in the cities of the plains that merited grace. And so God's judgment came. So anyway, really good discussion on that. He also touched on Deuteronomy 4. And we're not going to spend any time on this because just today, I put up a Disciple Dojo video on the chiasm of Deuteronomy 4. So the whole section, chapter verses 1 through 40 of Deuteronomy 4 is a chiasm, and he lists it on page 380. He points out the chiasm right here. The video that I posted today, I slightly modify this because I don't use exactly the terminology he uses. There's a way that makes a little more sense to me to keep it straight. But of course, my Bible I have it marked in is across the room. You can see it on the video today. In fact, go watch it. We could use the views. Our Bible study videos get way less views than our Bible reviews. But this chiasm is important for the whole history of Israel and what's going to happen. And the core, what God's saying is there's going to be judgment. Your God is a jealous God, a consuming fire. But on the flip side of that, there's going to be restoration because your God is a merciful God. So the chiasm all points to that. We talk about that in that video. And then lastly, again on page 390, he emphasizes once more that that in 1 Peter 2:9, with Peter using Old Testament Israel terminology to describe new covenant believers, he says, with one stroke, Peter connects his Christian readers with the whole heritage of Old Testament Israel. Indeed, he identifies them as spiritually the same people, organically continuous with those who heard at the foot of Mount Sinai the words he quotes. That's Exodus 9:19, 4 through 6. Heirs of the same purpose of God through the Messiah, Jesus. In doing so, Peter is consistent with the rest of the New Testament witness and claim those who are in Christ are the spiritual seed of Abraham, called for the same purpose, redeemed by the same God, committed to the same ethical obedience of faith. And then he makes sure to say in this, and this doesn't mean that Israel did not get replaced. To fulfill something is not to replace it. And for those of you that missed last week, just to recap, you had God called Israel, and they would be the means. These are the 12 tribes of Israel, and they would be the means by which God would reach the nations if they lived in covenant. So Abraham's seed, this promise, this covenant promise to Abraham's seed, you find it in Genesis 12, 15, and 17. And so the way that Israel collectively would be that seed would be through keeping the covenant, Exodus 19 and 20. If you obey my covenant, then you will be a kingdom of priests. You will mediate my presence to the world. Leviticus 18 through 20, the holiness code. This is what Jesus quoted from when people asked him what the greatest commandment. And then Deuteronomy 4 and 5 emphasized this, and 27 and 28 emphasized, but you're going to break it. And that's exactly what happened. Israel broke the covenant. And so all of this plan seems like it's lost. But the prophets came along and said, actually, God's going to make a new covenant. And it's not going to be like the Sinai covenant. It's going to be written on your heart. And Moses predicted this in Deuteronomy 29, talked about circumcised heart. Ezekiel predicted it in Ezekiel 36. Jeremiah predicted it, Jeremiah 31. So nothing has changed except the means by which God's people relate to God through the indwelling spirit writing the covenant on their hearts, rather than through trying to keep the nationalistic theocracy covenant people of God in a geographically limited place. But Israel hasn't changed. Israel are all the people who are Abraham's seed. And Paul flat out says in Galatians 3, if you are in Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, because to be in Christ is to be in Israel. And so we still have the mandate to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, to reach the nations. Only now Israel is not, well, it never was ethnically homogenous, but now it's even more so open to every tribe, language, people, and nation. So this is the plan under the old covenant, and this is the plan under the new covenant. Continuity and discontinuity. The discontinuity is the means by which we live the covenant ethic of God, but the mission is the same, to be the people of God in Messiah, in Jesus, because he is the one true Israelite. And then if we're in him, then we are his body, and we carry on the mission that God has called them to. So there's more on tabernacle stuff, eschatologically, like what it points forward to. The tabernacle symbolize the new heaven and new earth, which is depicted as the new Jerusalem. And in Ezekiel, that's the vision is of a new temple, and the imagery is replete in Revelation with new Eden imagery. So Isaiah sees this, Ezekiel sees this, and then John in Revelation sees this. So there's a lot of that stuff in there, but let's get to the breakout sessions.
Before we do that,
Okay, yeah, any questions?
we do have a couple of questions,
right.
maybe three. I have to scroll. One said, is it accurate to say the new covenant is an expansion of the old covenant?
Yes. Read Ezekiel, or I think it's Jeremiah. Jeremiah 31, I think. It says, I will make a new covenant. It will not be like the covenant I made with your ancestors when I took them by the hand and brought them out of Egypt. That's Jeremiah 31. So there's discontinuity. It's not just the same and it just gets a little bigger. It's radically different in some ways, but the ways that it's different are, it's not geographically limited anymore or passed on through ethnicity, and it's not written on stone tablets that we as a people collectively have to keep because we're in a covenant relationship with an ancient suzerain, Yahweh, as an ancient vassal state, Israel. Instead, it's been universalized. So you could say expanded, and I think that's not wrong. When Paul in Romans, he says, consider our father Abraham, to whom was promised the world. And he uses the word cosmos there. If you actually look in the Old Testament, Abram was not promised the world. He was promised the land. And so Paul does seem to think the land promised to Abraham in the new covenant gets expanded, I think would be an okay word. You just want to be a little careful that it's not like, well, we're just doing the same stuff as the old covenant, just with more people. So there's continuity and discontinuity in it.
Do you have time for one more question? I know we're
we can do one or two more.
There's one more question. So, and I'm going to read because there's a response as well. So I'm going to read them both in case that helps you with time. Can you explain what right means on page 371? He says ethics is the purpose of the election and the basis of the mission. And then we have a reply to that that says the next sentence is helpful. And he quotes, that is, God's election of Abraham is intended to produce a community committed to ethical reflection of God's character.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Yes, at the purpose of electing was so that the people who are elected, remember, election just means chosen for a purpose, that they would live in a way that is ethically different from the rest of the world for the long-term purpose of reaching the rest of the world by showing the world the type of God that they serve. So election and ethics were always bound up. This is faith and works. When people say, what's more important, faith or works? Yes, both. They're two sides of the same coin. You can't have faith without works. James says it's dead. But your faith is the saving thing. Faith comes first, and the works flow out of the faith. So both are essential. Works without faith is just, like I said, the Peace Corps. But faith without works is dead. So yeah, I think that is a good response. Any other questions?
We don't have anything else in the chat. Colton
Okay.
had a response regarding the covenant that Jason Staples' book, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, would be a good suggested reading in that case.
Yes. See the episode on the channel where Jason came on and we talked about who is Israel, and Jason, his book is where is it? It's like, well, of course it's on the shelf, you can't see, but his Paul and the Resurrection of Israel is a monumental work but it's not light reading. It's scholarly. It's heavily footnoted. If you think this is challenging, don't pick up Paul and the Resurrection of Israel because you'll be lost. But if you are like digging this and you want more and you want to get into the Septuagint concepts and the Greek terms and all that, Staples' book is an absolute banquet. Probably one of the best probably the best book I read in 2024 or 2025. I can't remember when I read it. Okay.
I think we're good. I don't think we have any other questions.
All right, so Cherie's gonna get the breakout rooms ready, and hopefully they'll go smoother this time because she's here running the show.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give you your let me pull up so this is the discussion question that you're going to talk about in your groups. On page 309, footnote 37, this is when it was talking about the liberation theology or personal piety, those two errors. It's going to talk about false gospel versus half gospel versus whole gospel. So I want you to talk about in your groups. The first question is what's the difference between those and why does it matter? And particularly if you can think of examples, like try to think of examples of false gospel, maybe half gospel, and what then the whole gospel would say to it. But don't try not to make these like theological arguments like Calvinism is half gospel and Arminianism is whole gospel, or, rapture theology. Like try not to wade into inner Christian conflicts, but actually, anyway, have fun with that one. And then the second question to discuss is about the Jubilee. And so there's a quote on page 318 about what God wanted, why he enacted or wanted the Jubilee to be enacted. Again, I don't think they ever kept it. Some people argue that they may have. But after having read this chapter, how would you explain the concept of Jubilee, both historically, like what it would have meant for ancient Israelites, and then its ongoing theological implications for Christians today? We don't live under the covenant. We can't keep the Jubilee. Even if we wanted to, we can't literally keep it. So what are some ways in which, just like Paul took don't muzzle an ox while it treads the grain, and he pulled the principle of that, meaning the worker deserves what it's working for to participate in it, and he applied that to taking care of clergy who are teaching you and providing for their needs? How do we pull the principle of Jubilee out? And then what are some ways that you could see applying it in your own life, in the life of the church, or in the life of Christians worldwide collectively? So those are our discussions. Cherie, tell us what to do.
We are good. If you're ready, I will send everyone to the breakout rooms.
All right. Any last minute? Speak now, forever hold your peace. Gather back in at the end. We're not going to spend much time at all. Just do a quick recap and close the session. But yeah, let's.
Yeah. This will be a 30-minute breakout room just like normal, so that'll put us right at about 10 after
Yeah.
9.
Yeah.
So,
And again, we started about 8 minutes late,
yep.
so we're still.
And we'll come back. So yeah, don't jump too quickly unless you have to. We'll come back for just a few minutes afterwards. So here we go.
Okay, so yeah, nothing. We're not going to spend a ton of time. Just wrap up. The next reading is going to be chapters 13, 14, and 15. Chapter 13 is going to be the last section or last chapter from this section of the book. And then chapter 14, I think, will start the next section or the next part of the book. We're going to be meeting on March 17th. That is St. Patrick's Day. So I want to see everyone dressed in honor of my people. Put on something green. We're going to celebrate. I might grow my beard a little longer and Irish it, leprechaun it up. But yeah, so we're going to meet together with St. Patty's and discuss those 3 chapters. In the meantime, a couple of you, like I said, you emailed me some questions and things, and you are absolutely free to do that. I'm going to do my best to, even if I can't respond or if I don't respond, like, feel free to message and I'll try to keep it in mind. And like I said, we're learning how to do all this as we do it. This is our first time. One of the things I did want to mention is, so Disciple Dojo, the ministry, we're kind of looking this year to basically raise a little bit more money because my insurance doubled. And a lot of people in the country, their insurance premiums doubled because our system is horrible in this country, and a lot of people are feeling that. But costs went up, and then that's part of Disciple Dojo's trying to be able to help me have insurance. So we're looking, and if you want to mention it or if you can help get the word out, we're really looking for like some $10 or $20 a month donors. $10 a month donors would be huge in helping offset that added expense. But if you're able to become a monthly dojo donor, it's not like a timeshare pitch where you've sat through the thing and now I ask you for money. But it is just saying all of this, like all the reading, all the prep work, all the everything, all that we're doing, I'm more than happy to do it. Just trusting that God brings some people that believe in this ministry. So if you've appreciated it and you're really getting something from it and you love it more, I guess what I'm saying is some people have said, oh yeah, I'd like to give, and they may give like $100 or something. It's actually better if we have smaller monthly gifts than people giving like one time a bigger amount. So if you're thinking about, yeah, I'd like to support the ministry, $10 a month, $15 a month, whatever you're able to do, that would be incredibly appreciative. If you are a monthly dojo donor, we've just gotten some new patches in, some of the new lighter color ones. So these patches are for our monthly donors, and it's just a way of thanking, not based on whatever amount you give. I don't see what you give $1 a month. I'll still send you a patch because I don't know. But all you have to do is just shoot me an email and say, I'm a dojo donor on a monthly basis, and tell me if you want a dark patch or a white patch. I would love to get one of these to you. You can put them on whatever you want. I think they go well on Richardson hats, which I order blank from Amazon and then just iron them on. So that, and then always our dojo store, we've got like our Old Testament timeline water bottle. A lot of this was created from Christopher Wright's work over the years, and they do keep ice cold all day. So stuff like that, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to push because this is starting to feel real pitchy, but just keep in mind, it is a ministry need, and we do not have any fundraising apparatus. So
I got my Old Testament timeline coffee mug right here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your quiet, your devotional reading time, just
That's right.
it percolates so much more when you're.
It's amazing
Dan,
how much better the coffee tastes in here.
Yes, Gerda. Yes.
yeah, I just want to encourage everybody that whatever amount of pages he gives us to read every week, it is possible to do it in one day because I had to do it that way
Oh
today.
Lord.
That's a trooper.
Wow.
You powered through 112 pages
Wow.
in a
Yeah,
day.
but I skipped the footnotes. I'll be honest.
Well, that does make reading faster too, and there's no shame in that. Yes, yeah. This week's reading is not. It's only 80 something pages. So if you were able to do the reading that we just done, it's not going to get more than that from here on until we're done. So we'll have 2 more sessions. I'm excited. Once we're done with this, again, you guys will have read, I think, and our friend Carmen Imes, she said it as well, and numerous others have said this is the best biblical theology overview out there of all the biblical theologies. So you're reading at the top tier, I think.